I'm Bill Reel. This is Jacob Hansen along for the ride again, so this will be a lot of fun. The first session we talked about morality. The second session we discussed, at least in part, faith crises. And here we are for session number 3. And today we're going to talk about testimony in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Restored Gospel, and how one can arrive at testimony and how one can know that that testimony has the best chance of being true versus other conclusions that could be drawn. So I wonder, Jacob, if you'd start us off, because when you framed this as a topic to go into, you shared with me that you've got the things that you depend on to kind of help you come up with what you see as an accurate, truthful, the best we can do. Again, we're all sort of guessing at it, right? The accurate, truthful way to arrive at knowing that the way you framed it in your mind about what's true and what isn't can be depended on. And so I wonder if you could start us off by kind of running us through that formula, helping people to understand what are the components of how you get to testimony, and let's go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, when we're talking about testimony, it's also important to kind of pull back a little bit and set up what are we talking about here? Because really what we're talking about is we're talking about knowledge. We're talking about how you know things, right? People go up and they bear what they know. They say that I know the church is true, right? And so one of the things that a person needs to first ask is, how do you know anything? Like, how do you know what you know? And what a lot of people don't realize is that that is the epistemological question. That is there's an entire philosophical field known as epistemology that explores the nature of knowledge and how do we know what we know. So it's actually a much deeper thing than a lot of people realize. And so you have to kind of dig down into, what does it mean to know things, and then explore what are the different ways that we know things, or that we say that we have any knowledge of anything. And I actually wanted to start off kind of and explore this together, right? So that we can both kind of move through this conversation in a way where we both are human beings who are being presented with, we both got to try and attain knowledge. Would you agree? Like we're both trying to acquire what we know and the nature of reality. Is that fair to say?
Yep, sure. I want to know reality as best I can, and I want to know as much of it as I can. Sure. Absolutely.
So with those slides that I have, some of those are the ones that if we could pull those up, that I think will help us here. So I like to kind of get rid of any presuppositions here. One thing that I think people may have gotten the impression of in the last conversation is that I presuppose the existence of God, that I operate from a theistic presuppositionalist standpoint, and I don't. I do not presuppose the existence of God. I believe you can arrive at a belief and or knowledge of God through particular sort of reasonings that you can do. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But you and I, as human beings, we're here and we both agree that we exist and that outside of us exists this thing that we call reality. Is that the way that you view the picture? I just want to kind of walk through this to see where we agree and where we disagree.
So there are possibilities that that's not true. For instance, being in a simulation, for example.
Yeah. That's.
But I want to, in my world, and I pretend at least, and I agree that it's the most rational perspective, that we are real, we do exist, and there is a reality to get closer to.
Okay, cool. And so that reality, what I'll call that reality is, when I use the word truth, that something is true, what I'm saying is that it pertains to reality, right? Like it is in accordance with reality. It's something that actually exists. Okay. So if you go in there to the second slide, we start to get to this issue of perception, right? And I think maybe this is where there was a disconnect in our last conversation, was when we're talking about, is there an objective reality out there? I think, and this is my my take on this is that we probably both agree on that, or at least we will presuppose that a reality exists outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
But what maybe you're saying is that it's not objective because our experience of reality has to be filtered through ourself. So all that we have is our subjective perception of reality. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I'll go with that for the moment. Again, you're putting this to me in the right now, and I would want to think these things through before I have to be held to it. But for the conversation's sake, yes.
And fair enough. You can say tentatively, like, that seems okay. But obviously, and I'm not trying to trap you here. I just want to
there may be flaws in thinking that, not having a ton of background in philosophy, I may not see my own blind spots. Right?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, no, and just so you know, and just so everyone knows, I'm approaching this conversation with a lot of epistemic humility. Okay,
Yeah.
These are very deep philosophical questions, but this is the model upon which I think I operate, and I think most people operate. Right? That there exists outside of us this reality, but that we perceive this reality through witnesses. For instance, our eyeballs. Our eyeballs act as a witness to what is out there. But as you and I know, and everyone knows, your eyeballs can actually deceive you, right? Like you could actually be not seeing what's actually there. And so the question is we have these things that witness to us what is real. And then it processes through us to color the way that we perceive the world, the way that we see the world. Okay. And so when we're dealing with epistemology, or the how do we know things, there becomes this question is okay, well, what are the legitimate sort of senses or witnesses that we can take in that give us an accurate picture of the nature of reality itself? Okay. Now, if you go to the next slide, we get into, this is another thing, is the language. There's some language issues here when we talk about knowledge, right? One thing is that if you say that you know something, and I'm going to talk right now about rational knowledge, because I think that's what most people are talking about when they're talking about knowledge. They're talking about things that you can know rationally speaking, right? The problem is that, and this is kind of the bold assertion of a philosopher like René Descartes, is that there's very, very few things to almost nothing that you actually have 100% epistemological certainty about. Okay. Like I can say, yeah, I know Bill's right here. Like I can see him, but I'm only 99.999% confident of that because I could be living in a matrix. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So what we have here is knowledge. When someone says that they know something, what they're saying is that there's a certain level of confidence that they've reached to where they no longer say, I believe so, or I think Bill is here talking to me. They say, I know it. So to say that you know something is just to say that you are highly, 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 highly confident that that thing is the way that it is. Okay. Now that is if you're talking about sort of what we'll call rational knowledge. But I serve my mission in Argentina, so I speak Spanish, and anyone who speaks Spanish knows there's actually two different words in Spanish for to know things. And this is also, I believe, true in Latin and Greek as well, as there's different sort of ways of knowing things linguistically. And there's the word saber, which is to know something sort of rationally or cognitively. And then there's conocer. Now, conocer, they'll say it's kind of like to be familiar with something, right? It's to know it like experientially, right? There's a difference between maybe knowing about love, like I could write a really good philosophical essay about love, and then knowing love because you've experienced love. Does that make sense, Bill?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just want to make sure you're following along. So we have to make sure that we recognize that there's different sort of categories of knowledge that human beings talk about linguistically when they're talking about knowledge. Okay. So the question becomes, okay, but on what basis can you say that you have a higher or lower level of confidence in any given proposition that's out there, right? And that's where I go to sort of this idea of witnesses to the truth, okay, that help us to approximate what is and is not true. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, slide 4, if I let's say that somebody comes up to me, because you and I both kind of agree that, well, I guess I'm gonna, at least rationally speaking, you can't directly contact the external reality that's out there.
Right. We're all making our best guess at it. Sure.
Yeah, because it's being given to us through witnesses that are fallible ultimately, right? Like my eyes even. So if I always say, it's kind of like, imagine that you were the judge, the guy in the tie there, but you have these witnesses that are telling you about what's going on in the outside world, right? So if you have a single person come to you as a judge and say, hey, I saw this person run a red light, you'll have a level of confidence that that's true, depending on the person and their reliability. But there is a, so there's this level of confidence that you get, but it's not perfect. It's not, just because one person says something doesn't mean that it's the case. But if you go down to the next slide, and you have 5 witnesses who all come in and say, hey, we all saw her run the red light, your confidence continues to go up. Also,
especially if those 5 don't know each other, or they're not connected, or they're not in the vehicle that got hit by. Totally.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. If these things are in independent spheres.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So now if we go down to the next slide, we get into, but then you get the problem of, what if witnesses conflict? You know what I mean? What if one person says that the car was green, the other person says that the car was red? And so suddenly the level of confidence in a given proposition, based on the witnesses that you receive, if they're conflicting, the level of confidence gets changed by this, right? So the question becomes, well, what are the witnesses to reality, right? Like we've already talked about our eyes, for instance. We could call that sort of sensory data is a witness to the truth and to the nature of reality. But if you come down here to the next one, number 7, this is sort of, so I asked myself a question. How do I know anything? And I began to explore how people justify what they say they know or have any confidence in at all. And I came up with what I call the 5 witness model, or the collective witness model of epistemology. And this is kind of my thing. And it's not, just so everyone knows, this isn't like unique to me. I didn't invent this per se. All of this is a others have talked about this, haven't maybe coined this exact term for it. But you have things like, let's just start on the far right there, authority. So, Bill, how do you know that there are moons surrounding planets in another galaxy?
Right. I have to trust the experts who have shown themselves over time to be accurate and competent at the things that they claim.
Yes, absolutely. So that is authority. We appeal to authority, and it is legitimate and rational to appeal to authority when an authority has shown themselves to be trustworthy over time. But that is one witness, because we all know that authorities also are fallible, right? And so just because someone is an expert, we don't need to abandon all of the rest of the epistemological tools that we have, right? Does that make sense?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So now as we go to, now let's talk about reason, okay? Reason is another way that we can come to know the truth of something. The only caveat, and when I talk about reason, I'm talking about premises. I'm basically talking about logic. A plus B equals AB. You know what I'm saying?
We got to pause there for a moment.
Go ahead.
Only because logic and reason are actually very different things.
Okay.
And so logic, do you mind if I put a slide up and just explain?
Yeah, go ahead.
I want the audience to be on the same page. So let me sneak over here. Logic, for instance, is in both of these statements. Elizabeth owns either a Honda or a Saturn. Elizabeth does not own a Honda, therefore Elizabeth owns a Saturn. Also, logic is available in all toasters are items made of gold, all items made of gold are time travel devices. Therefore, all toasters are time travel devices.
Yes.
But the second one's not reasonable. And what reason requires of us is to go into our premises and to be able to establish that our way of getting to our conclusion is the least inferential versus the other argumentation that someone else is presenting. So while the second statement is logical, it isn't reasonable. And those two are very different things. And so I just want to, if you want to do that, that's fine. But I would want you not to call reason, logic reason. I would want you to just be clear that we're talking about logic only.
Yes.
So for instance, reason would say, we all, we can do the science. We know toasters aren't made of gold, at least most of them. Maybe somebody out there has one, but I highly doubt that. So all items are made of gold or time travel devices. We can again show that that's unreasonable. It requires too much inference, too much conjecture.
Yeah, there's not enough data there, right? It's the data says otherwise.
No, there's plenty of data there. We know that those statements are false.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying is that the data actually can adjudicate the question. So when I'm talking about and there's two different things there to when you're talking about reason, maybe I'm talking about logic itself.
Yeah.
Because logic is sort of is it coherent, right? But just because something is coherent, as you've already shown in that last slide, something can be coherent, but it can still be not true just because one of those premises were false, right? Based on the data. My point is that your logic or as I would put it, reason, because I use the two kind of interchangeably, is based on the data that's put into it, right? Like you can arrive at erroneous logical conclusions based on bad data that you have or incomplete data that can lead you down not seeing the full picture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just FYI. So one person here is saying, Bill, you have a super bad echo on Jacob's channel, which means I'm probably coming through twice.
Okay, let me
maybe if you
I think it should be, let me see if it's coming through.
Yeah, if you mute me on StreamYard on your side, I should only come through.
Okay, people, can you hear? Somebody make a comment if they can still hear Bill. Bill, go ahead and just give a talk.
Yep. Absolutely. So my name is Bill Reel, Executive Director of Mormon Discussion Incorporated. We'll see if somebody
can people hear Bill. I see something. Someone said echo is better for sure, but I just want to see if they're still hearing you at all on my end.
Yeah, totally.
They say he's really quiet now. Hold on one sec.
My hunch is that you need me to come through normally on StreamYard, but somehow I'm coming through your mic earphones through your computer as well.
Let me just check something real quick on my end with audio. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna turn you back on.
And folks, just FYI, for those who are listening on our YouTube channel with Mormon Discussion, yes, everything is going to sound great there. Where the technical issue is on Jacob's side with his channel.
Yeah, as I'm streaming it over there at the same time.
For just a moment, we just want to make sure that the folks following him and listening on his side can also enjoy the conversation.
Okay, now they should be able to hear it, but they're hearing an echo. Folks. They said. Let me do this real quick.
Yep. Like I hear everything's good on my end, of course, but yeah. Yep. During this time of great excitement, my mind was called up to serious reflection and great uneasiness.
Okay, so as I'm coming through, that's funny because they said they couldn't hear me now. Shoot. Echo is gone, echo is back. That's so funny because I feel like we're doing it the same way as we did last time. Sorry, everybody, about the technical difficulties here. We'll have to fix this. Okay, they say they can hear me. All right, Bill, go ahead and give a check 1, 2, 3. Let's hear
Yep,
one more.
check 1, 2, 3. Check baby 1, 2, 3.
Okay, people are saying we're both good on my end, but
Perfect.
it's funny because I didn't really change anything. Here we go.
So just to note, you're using reason in place of the word logic here, when really you seem to indicate you mean logic, and that just because a argument is logical, it may still be deeply unreasonable, ridiculous, or absurd.
Yeah, I guess the only distinction here, and this maybe is just a linguistic thing that we're doing here, is you're kind of saying that it's reasonable if it's true. Could something, the way you're framing it, could something be reasonable and untrue?
I don't know if I want to use that language. So I would say that the most using reason is trying to figure out which of the arguments in a disagreement requires the least inferences. And so whichever set of premises can be shown to have the least amount of conjecture, that's the most rational, reasonable conclusion. It could still be untrue, but we have to go with the most rational conclusion, because if we go with anything less, we're being irrational.
Yes. Yeah, that's fair enough. And I would say that reason and logic are very much predicated on the data that gets fed into them, right? If you are fed bad data, you can come to untrue things, even though you are being perfectly logical. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's talk about, obviously you get data. One of the ways that you get data is through sense data, right? Through your eyes, through your ears, through all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. We also will talk, though, about things being true based on their outcomes. So, for instance, the only reason that you trust an authority is because an authority is that an authority has shown through the outcomes of what they're doing that in reality they actually know what they're talking about. Does that make sense? So the outcomes are one of the ways that we validate that something pertains to reality, that it is.
For instance, I can't understand exactly everything about gravity. I'm not a scientist. It's not my specialty. But I throw an apple up, it comes down. So hence I trust that the experts on gravity are telling the truth, because everywhere I see it, it works the way they say it does.
Yep. Exactly. Very good.
Right.
And then I'm going to come to the last one. And this is one that a lot of it's of all of them, it's the toughest one to describe. Okay. But there is, I think, at least people will posit that there is such a thing as intuitive knowledge, right? That there are things that you know, but that are very, very difficult to say exactly why you know them. They are just evident to you in some way. So for instance, you will say, racism is wrong. And if you're going to, or that it's wrong to cause harm, right? Like these are or unnecessary harm, as you might say it. These are intuitive judgments that we make. And again, I want to say, I know I'm not encapsulating this fully, because intuition is one of those hard things to describe, but we all kind of quote unquote know what it is, because of it's more of an experiential thing than it is something that is purely cognitive in some way. Does that sort of make sense?
Yes. Let me just throw another person here saying, I just want to see if you agree, because then there would be limits to what you're posing. The model that you're showing emphasizes deductive and inductive logic, but neglects retroductive and abductive logic. Do you agree with that?
So
I don't even know what that means.
I'm not sure. I'm not super familiar with retroductive. I am familiar with abductive reasoning. So this is abductive reasoning is essentially an inference to the best explanation of something. So if you have a competing set of things that propositions, it's all right. Well, which one seems to be the most probable? And in fact, this is very much what I'm going to go into in this. So as we go further in this, that might become clarified.
And then the second point would be, when you ask me if I agree with what you said about intuition, with the caveat that some folks get their intuitions right and some folks their intuitions wrong. And there may be an ability to say some people are better with their intuition than others, but to note that intuition is based on whatever came before for you, and you're making essentially this gut feeling about what's about to happen or what things are, and that can be deeply hit or miss with various ratios of success.
100%, 100%. So here's where I would go with this. Let's go to slide 10, and you're actually hitting on what I call, and it's something that I get frustrated with, even with members of the church, is what I call the feelings alone heresy. This is where it's sort of like you ignore all the other witnesses, right? It doesn't matter what the outcomes are. It doesn't matter what sense data say. It doesn't matter what reason says. It doesn't matter what authorities say. It's just whatever I feel is what is true. And that's just a distorted like you're just ignoring all of the other ways to know truth, and you're purely going internally to say that truth is what I feel it is, rather than truth being something that exists outside of just your feelings or and I don't even call them feelings, because I think that can sort of cheapen it. I like to use the word intuition because we'd be crazy to say that we don't intuit things, or there aren't things that we have intuitive knowledge of. It's just to deny, in my opinion, an aspect of our nature as human beings. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I am very much against what I call the feelings alone heresy, and it happens within the church, and it can happen outside of the church in other contexts as well, where people will say that's kind of everything rests on that. Now, if you go to the next slide, there's another heresy that I see happen both inside and outside the church, and that's the authority alone fallacy. That's where you ignore all other witnesses to truth simply to say that, well, if the brethren said it, it's true, right? It doesn't matter what everything else says. And I would also say, though, in a secular context, those who say, well, the experts say it, therefore it's true, and they don't feel the need to provide any reason or any outcomes, or any of the other witnesses here, no matter how irrational something is. It's like, well, the authorities said it, therefore it's true. And so we have to be careful, because while any one of these witnesses is a witness that should be taken into account, we have to be careful that we don't ever get into the habit of saying, hey, this one is the trump card. One of the big critiques that I have, for instance, of the doctrine of sola scriptura, which is held by a lot of other faiths, and scriptural infallibility, is the claim that the authority of the written words in the Bible in their original autographs is the trump card. It is the word of God. It is like, it can't be wrong. And that is to say that those people who wrote those words acted infallibly. And so anytime you want to say either intuition or outcomes or sense data or any of these things trump all the rest and is 100% reliable, it is to claim that one of these witnesses is infallible. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
if the moment that someone claims that one, and there's this, it's an unhealthy quest, in my opinion, for infallibility. Because the idea is, if you can find an infallible source of truth, well, then you can that thing is the only thing that really matters, because it will give you the truth 100%, right? Whether that's authority, intuition, whatever. And so this is the model by which I sort of judge these things. Now, I would go one more slide down to just some of these questions that I ask. Are one of these more important than the others? Is one the trump card, or does it depend on the context? And that's very much, I think this is a very important recognition. For instance, if I'm dealing with the physical world and the nature of subatomic particles, I'm going to spend a lot more time looking at things like sense data, or not even sense data, really, mostly authority, because I've never seen that stuff, and reason are going to be kind of the two areas where I spend most of my time exploring what has been said by authorities to then determine, because again, unless I'm actually doing the experience and seeing with my own eyes the subatomic reactions or whatever, and in fact, even the authorities, when it comes to subatomic particles, they can't even use their physical senses to see them. They have to do experiments and other things that give them data that they can then use reason to arrive at conclusions about, right? So, but then again, now I'm talking about, what about human relationships, right? If I'm studying the nature of our human interactions with one another, and what produces the best, let's say, family dynamics or something like that, I may look more, I'm not going to be using sense data per se, right? I'm going to be utilizing more intuition, outcomes, and other things of that nature to arrive at what the truth is around those sorts of phenomena. So it is very much, again, imagine that you have witnesses who are coming forward, but these witnesses have different areas of expertise that allow you to rely more heavily on one rather than another in a given context. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So if we continue to go on in the next one here, in slide 13, as I was exploring this subject of knowledge, I was trying to figure out, I noticed something. For instance, it was very clear to me that authority emerges from outcomes, because someone isn't an authority unless they actually, through the outcomes, like demonstrate what they are, that they actually know what the heck they're talking about, and that they can be relied on as an authority, right? Including yourself, by the way. You know, your own intuition is a source of, in a way, it's a source of authority, where you through the outcomes begin to trust what you think, right? Where if you get things wrong over and over and over, you start to go, well, maybe I shouldn't trust just whatever I feel, because I'm really bad at reason. I'm really bad at my intuitions. I'm just going to kind of trust in the authorities and what they say, right? But it was clear, again, the point I'm making is that authority emerges from outcomes. And then I began to ask myself the question, but wait a minute, does outcomes emerge from something, right? And it really emerges from reason. It's rational that if something is producing a similar outcome over time, that you can infer that those outcomes will continue into the future. Although I think Hume makes a pretty powerful critique of this, but that's kind of a different subject. So then I began to look at even things like reason. Like, is reason fundamental? Like, is there something out there that's the most fundamental of all? But as we talked about ourselves, reason itself, and by the way, this little model that I have up on the screen, if you want to know like where I'm at, where I'm still trying to like sort things out, there are things I'm more like feel like I've kind of mapped out and understand. This area of the interplay and relationships between these and what emerges from what is an area that I'm still deeply exploring. So please recognize, everyone, I'm not like stating this like, oh, this is the way it is. I'm kind of laying out a model of understanding that I have here. But it seems here that even reason itself is dependent on the data that's fed into it. As we had said before, you can be perfectly logical, but just get the wrong, not have all the data. Does that make sense?
Yes. I assume you would agree that we do the best we can. And again, I'm a little caught off guard, because as we show all these slides, again, I would want to keep inserting logic where you have the word reason, because I think reason is the underlying principle that then points to all 5 of these and gives you the best way in which to measure. And again, we're all limited. I'm not a scientist, so we'll get into quantum mechanics. I have to trust the authorities, and I can test them against other authorities, and I can use whatever other skill sets I have to try to figure out which authority is creating the least amount of conjecture to get to their conclusion.
You're testing the authority utilizing reason.
But so I agree with you with the caveat that reason, which I don't think you're exactly hitting at, is the thing we use to test all 5 of these. with your reason actually being logic.
Yeah, I would, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. And here's what I mean by that. When we're engaging in conversation, we're actually engaging in reason. We're engaging in logic. We're utilizing language to discuss things that are like you would say, the words are, we ascribe meaning to these words. We hope the other person understands what we mean. But what's actually happening is I'm trying to convey intuitive, sensory sort of experiences that I've had. I'm trying to transform those into a linguistic model that I'm then conveying over to you so that you can then understand what's going on. Like, you're able to connect the experiences and things that I'm having with reality, with yours, and you're saying, hey, we both are seeing the same reality, right? So there's, but what I'm saying is that it seemed, and this is the question I guess I'm trying to address. I was asking the question, is reason fundamental to knowledge? Is it like where everything ultimately gets to, right? And what I found is that no, reason seems to be a tool that we use to play with the raw data, to organize it and to analyze it. But it's not the raw data itself. Does that make any sense?
Yes, but not exactly. But continue, please. Like, I'll work with that premise, and then when you're done, I'll kind of present maybe a different thought around all of this.
Yeah,
but go ahead.
That's fine. So what I have found as I've done this, and I have, just so anybody wants to see me lay this out fully here with all of the citations and like different people talking about it, is on my channel. I have a playlist of how do you know, and it basically goes through this collective witness model from start to finish in more detail. But what I arrive at in that is that basically our intuitive experience of the world is actually the most fundamental thing. It is what is, right? Like, I think Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, right? And what he means by that is that Descartes he wanted to rationally base everything. And what he came down to was, as he was reasoning, the only thing that he could get to that was sort of infallible was that he existed, because it couldn't be otherwise. There wasn't a possibility he couldn't exist, because in order to even think about things, he had to exist, was his basic contention. And so the experience of actually being, of existing, and I would say, and this is where words begin to fall apart. I think at some part, language actually, you run out of language to even describe what's going on. The only thing you can do is you can say there's something that you experience that then acts as the lens through which you view the world. If you go to the next slide, Stephen R. Covey has this quote where he says, we see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we are conditioned to see it. When we open our mouths to describe what we see, we in effect describe ourselves, our perceptions, and our paradigms. In other words, the world may be objective, but it's being filtered through our intuitive experience of it. And so Jonathan Haidt, if you go to the next slide, has this really great example that he uses of the rider and the elephant. And again, if we're asking if reason is fundamental, he very much rejects this. Jonathan Haidt says what reason is, and rationality is us giving a post hoc explanation to the intuitive experiences that we have. And that doesn't mean that what we're saying doesn't pertain to reality, or that reason has no use. It's just, I guess I would say, kind of like I was saying before, that reason is subject to the data that you're feeding it. And so the real question becomes like, what is the raw data that you're feeding into human beings? And so if you go back up to slide number 13, I would say that something approximating intuition is really where the rubber meets the road. That is where we interface with reality. I can be blind, I can be deaf, I can have all these sorts of things gone, but the thing that will still remain is this, whatever this conscious intuitive experience is. And so just to kind of reiterate, I can kind of go back to the very beginning here, is that human beings are trying to understand the nature of reality. Some will say that reality is merely the physical, that encapsulates the full breadth of reality. If you want to go back here real quick to slide number 2, I think just so we can visualize kind of what's in my mind as I'm talking about this, is that there's a big question of that big ball over that reality that we're in that's apart from us. What is the nature of it? Is it purely just material? Is that the presupposition that you're going into in the world? Does a purely materialistic explanation account for things like consciousness, things like morality, things like thought? Or is reality something bigger than that? Is there a realm that extends beyond that? And I mean, these are really deep questions. But the thing is that depending on what you presuppose will depend on what tools you even think are legitimate. Because if everything can be explained if you presuppose that the world is purely a physical Newtonian world, which I think we both would reject that it's not because of the nature of quantum and Einsteinian physics, we have to recognize that and I would say that there's a world of conscious experience, and that reality becomes something much bigger, much more dynamic, and therefore you need additional tools to be able to fully comprehend the nature of reality. And so when I talk about my testimony within the context of the church, is my testimony is the collection of these witnesses and what they tell me. I will then go and bear to others my testimony of what I perceive this reality to be based on what I think are all of these tools that we have to help us perceive the nature of reality. And when we say, does somebody have a testimony in the church, what we generally are referring to is that they are someone who has received a witness of the reality that is, it can be any aspect of reality, but often in the church, we're talking about the nature of the reality that extends beyond the mere physical or the mere material, and that reality is something bigger than that. And they are witnessing what they have experienced in relation to that aspect of reality. And so anyway, that is my explanation of, or my best approximate explanation of understanding the nature of reality itself. And so I'm curious to see it, contrast maybe your model for understanding reality and how that maybe contrasts or conflicts with the things that I'm talking about.
Sweet. So, and I want to note here, because so we've been going now for about almost 45 minutes. I know a few minutes of that was technical issues, and there was an introduction at the beginning by me. So let's at least let me kind of control the conversation for maybe the next 35 minutes or so.
Yeah, that's fine.
So the first thing is that when you say intuition is really kind of the main push, I would note in the arena of religious belief, the far wide majority of human beings on this planet, when trying to deal with which religion is true and which belief system is true, no matter which system you agree is right, or if you don't believe any of them, we would all have to agree that almost everyone is getting it wrong. In other words, if you believe Mormonism is true, the people using their intuition to know that Jehovah's Witnesses are true, or Catholicism is true, or Islam is true, are incorrect.
I would say that intuition alone is a terrible tool to use for evaluating any truth claim.
Sweet. So let me throw this up. So throughout your slides, you're using the word reason when you actually mean logic. And we talked a moment ago about how logic and reason differ. With every one of your 5 tools, the only way we can, inside ourselves, figure out what is the most rational answer to authority, whether they're being truthful or accurate, whether our intuition is right or not, whether the outcomes are tied to actual truth, or if it's just coincidence or some other explanation, is to use rational thinking. And so anytime you make a premise or an imposition or a belief, we have to then go, is that reasonable or not? And using reason, so for instance, we talked about both of those are logical, only the top one is reasonable. Let me read this. Obviously, the premises in this argument are not true, meaning the toasters one. It may be hard to imagine these premises being true, but it is not hard to see that if they were true, their truth would logically guarantee the conclusion's truth. It is easy to see that the previous example is not an example of a completely good argument. A valid or logical argument may still have a false conclusion. When we construct our arguments, we may aim to construct one that is not only valid or logical, but also sound or reasonable. A sound argument is one that is not only valid, but begins with premises that are actually true. Now, we're in this realm where we're talking about testimony and Mormonism and truth claims. We're not exactly going to be able to definitively go, here's a wood table here. We're going to have to play in the realm of not being absolutely certain that something is true. When we can agree on the premise being true, the premise that is the least inferential, the least allowances or conjecture, is the most rational premise. All other premises are irrational. So, if we use rhetoric or argumentation and make our arguments based on logic,
can I just make sure? Can I just make sure I'm understanding correctly? I just want to make sure that I'm not going off. So what you're talking about is that there's a difference between the soundness of an argument and the validity of an argument. And validity means it follows the appropriate logical structure, right? Premise, conclusion. But it's only sound if those premises are true. Because if the premises are false, you can have a valid argument that's not sound simply because one of the premises are not true.
I would also argue that in this space, we would have to say it is sound if it is the most likely conclusion to be true based on the data and what's going on. So because we can't really know, right? Like we can't exactly, I'm 100%, you know.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I know what you're saying. Let me just see if I can restate it. So you're saying that, for instance, in this, all toasters are items made of gold. That's just a false. That's a flawed premise. So that's why this argument is valid, but it isn't sound. And the reason that it is, and we know that because we have experiences in the world with other items that are not made of gold.
Right. This one we can prove, but in matters of religious belief, we can't prove. Even when the odds are deeply stacked against Scientology. You and I both agree Scientology is absurd. But it's so stacked against Scientology that we still can't, in that realm, push the imposition that it's absolutely false. There's no way to do that. So
you can't prove a negative.
So the best we can do is to figure out whether Scientology being true or Scientology being false, which conclusion requires the least amount of conjecture and allowances and inferences. Okay. All right. So with that, for instance, if we have a crime scene here, we see something's going on, there's police tape, there's things broken, there's splatter on the wall. We could suggest that it's a vandal. We could suggest it's a baby. We could suggest it's leprechauns. And we could use all of your 5 tools to arrive at any of those 3 decisions. But the way that we figure it out is by using reason. And so we look at what makes the most rational sense to figure out what is going on. And I think you agree with that. Like, at least
Now I would say there is one thing here that we have to take into consideration Okay. And that is an actual experience that you were there at the crime scene. And you were there and actually, like, it was a baby that did it. You know what I mean? Like it was some kind of crazy super baby that was there.
Sure, but then you're going to explain your reason, and you're going to convince me, or try to anyway, that the baby doing it it requires the least amount of inferences and conjecture.
Well,
and you're going to be able to add how the baby did all these things, so that I'm now going to be able to have new information and change my mind to a new conclusion.
You're right. You're right. Now here's the thing, though. If you were there and you saw the baby do it or whatever, you saw a leprechaun, or obviously these are kind of crazy examples. But the thing is that I could never convince you unless you saw it yourself.
I disagree. I can become convinced of things based on it being the most rational.
Based on it merely being the testimony of another person, you could be convinced?
No, what I'm saying is that if you explain your reasons, if you say, look, I was there, I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. The baby was doing this, it led to that, here's how this got. Now you're adding information that now makes the conclusion that the baby did it able to be now weighed on a different set of my perception of what's going on. I can change my conclusion, or what I think is rational or absurd, based on the new information of you explaining how the baby did all the things it did.
Okay, and then fair enough. But if, let's say it was a leprechaun, right? Like you just would say leprechauns don't exist. You presuppose that they simply do not exist. And so are you actually saying that if I saw a leprechaun do something, you could actually be convinced that a leprechaun exists merely off the testimony of another person without actually having experienced one yourself?
Yeah, because each imposition that you suggest is going to have to, again, cross a threshold where it is the conclusion that requires the least amount of allowances and conjecture. Because even if you say I'm there and I saw the leprechaun, there are possibilities such as you're mentally ill, or that you were on psychedelic drugs. And hence your inner experience is never on its own going to be enough to convince any other human of anything unless people are willing to be irrational.
Yeah, and I might say that and I think that's why I say that actual direct experience with something is the most fundamental. Because, like, for instance, what if we're dealing, like, talking about God, what is the, like, evidence, like if you saw God, if God popped into the room right now and spoke to you and said, "Hey, Bill, I'm real," based on reason, you would rightly say that wasn't God, I was hallucinating.
Regardless of what I say, it would still be my own internal experience, and it wouldn't be justification for anybody else to take my word for it.
That's fine, and fair enough. But would you say that experience is valid?
If that happened to me, I would use reason to try to figure out if I was mentally ill or if I was wrong about there being a supreme being.
So if someone's lived experience doesn't accord with reality or reason, then we can say that person's experience is not valid.
Everyone's experience is valid. You sense the data that comes into your senses. No one can take that away from you. The interpretation you apply to it is up for lots of misunderstanding and misinterpretation. And hence, when you claim things that have no outward evidence for them, you're claiming an internal experience, and there's no way for that to hold any weight with anyone outside of yourself if there is no reason behind why that is true. Otherwise, everyone is competing in this arena of religious belief, and I'd have no way to really know.
But isn't that kind of the same thing that people bring up? Like, for instance, and I don't want to derail it, and I'll get back to this, but I just feel like I see people outside of religion talk about the validity of, for instance, trans people's experience, and that even if it doesn't accord with reason, that their experiences are valid, and that, but in my mind, it's like a person's, and I agree with you actually, if a person's experiences do not accord with reality and with reason, well, then they're probably misinterpreting their experience. And the only way that I can know that they're not is to actually have the experience myself. But if I don't have the experience, then as an outside observer, I have to conclude that this person is irrational.
Yeah. The difference is that you're right to an extent. So the trans person is having an experience. We are going to be limited at understanding that experience from genetics or epigenetics or science, maybe altogether. But those things do play a role. And so I feel, for instance, when I deal with the trans issue different than other folks, that I'm actually using some degree of reason as I lean on the prevailing psychologist and geneticist talking to me, not just about trans issues, but other things for which aren't showing up in the majority of humans, but for which show up in a small percentage. For instance, serial killers and pedophiles, and us knowing that that's epigenetic. It seems also to make sense that there would be other anomalies within human expression that aren't the majority, that science would then defend as going like, hey, it's reasonable that even though we can't quite get to the heart of this, that there is at least the possibility this is a real experience. And should we again trust authorities or science?
I see. So just to make sure I understand, you're saying that hypothetically these things are caused by genetic factors, epigenetic factors within trans people, and so we could actually have the ability to use science to, at least hypothetically, to determine if a person really is trans or not based on what the actual data and science say.
Yeah, we should go with whatever position requires the least amount of inferences or conjecture. And I don't want to get lost in this issue because
that's fine. And,
it really isn't.
And the only reason I'm bringing it up is it just has to do with the idea of is experience most fundamental or is reason most fundamental? Because you could have an experience of something, and then I think you can use reason to either misinterpret it or to misrepresent it. But I also would say that the experience itself, the raw data of the experience, is the most fundamental thing, because reason ultimately is a tool that we're using based on the data that's actually coming in, right?
With the acknowledgement that experience in the arena of religious belief leads the majority of people, by far, significant majority, to be wrong at any given moment.
Yeah, I would say that if you're just relying on the data alone, you're not, or I'm sorry, just relying on the intuitive experience alone and not taking into account the other witnesses of truth, I do think that will lead you astray. And it's one of the reasons that I, to the Latter-day Saints, am like the people who push kind of like, well, I feel it, therefore it's true. It's like, no, like you got to do better than that. I'm not denying that experience may be fundamental and important, but we have to interpret these experiences according to things beyond just, hey, just because I felt it, therefore it is. But it's a tough question, because if God appears to you, you can reason your way out of believing that it was God, even if it was God.
Totally. Reason is also flawed because we never have all the evidence, but it's the best we can do is to be reasonable. If we're unreasonable, then we can certainly believe in absurd things, and those absurd things could turn out to be true, but it will be the learning of new data on some sort that will convince us that it's true. We don't believe things we shouldn't anyway. We shouldn't believe things to be true before it's the most rational thing to believe.
But is that the case? Like, I mean, can reason be used to justify things that are horrible? But hey, it's reasonable, therefore we should do it. I mean, I think scientifically it is reasonable if your goal is the propagation and success of the human species, to eliminate in some way those who are, weakening the herd, and therefore, kind of eugenics makes perfect rational sense from that sort of a perspective. And so reason, in my mind, has to be subject to values. I would say that values are actually more fundamental than reason, because reason becomes the tool that we use to sort of impose our values, or to try and make manifest our values on the in the world. And so if your values are wrong, like like Hitler or something, he can use reason to do terrible, terrible things.
He can use logic. This is where we're confusing the two. So I don't agree with your premise.
Okay.
All right. So let me use an example.
Go ahead.
And I'm gonna ask you to kind of permit yourself. Let me just do it this way. Did you watch Mormonism Live this week? You probably didn't, I'm assuming.
I did actually watch some of it. Okay. Bits and pieces.
Okay. So let's just take a claim, for instance. And I don't want to do this thing where we're like, okay, the CES letter, point number 1, where do you, I want to address it from this issue of like critical thinking and how we use rationale and reason in the arena of religious belief. Joseph Smith here claims that he knows the Adamic language. Mm-hmm. In telling us the Adamic language, he is using both, he is telling us the Adamic language includes English and foreign words that sound similar to English words from an ancient language we couldn't know anything about. But he is claiming specifically the ancient language itself contains both words that are similar to words that we know but are from an ancient language and English. Based on reason and critical thinking, does Joseph Smith know the Adamic language?
No, I don't think he does.
No, he doesn't. Okay. Joseph Smith here claims that Mormon means literally more good. It's the Egyptian word mon that means good, and it's combined with the contraction of an English word more. Do you think Joseph Smith here understands or comprehends how to actually translate the word Mormon?
No.
No. When we go to the book of Moses and we find scriptures in there that are deeply connected to the book of Luke and the book of Matthew in such a way that it seems as though the person writing the book of Moses is going to the book of Luke and the book of Matthew and copying themes and then implementing them into the book of Moses as if it was a unique text tied directly to Moses's experience. Does your critical thinking skills, do red flags go up that something other than an authentic translation of an ancient text is happening?
Well, I would say that I don't believe that the best explanations for the translations given by Joseph Smith are direct word-for-word translations. I ascribe more to Blake Ostler's sort of expansion theory and that kind of stuff. But I want to, real quick,
hold on. Doesn't that start with doesn't that point of view start with the conclusion one wants to have, that the church be true? And then comes up with, again, inferences, which you're doing when you say like, oh, like if we allow this to happen and Joseph's doing that, and if we allow a tight translation and a loose translation, do you sense that you're adding conjecture to the argument?
It depends on the premises that you've already accepted. Okay. So this is the way that I use the understanding, and why I brought up kind of those models of understanding, right? Having discussions about Joseph Smith's translation methods, of course, make absolutely no sense without certain premises that you have to have already arrived at, right?
Give me a premise that you're willing to defend as the one that, like, I want to know how you got to the premise.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. It goes like this. So here's the way I get here. Okay. So it begins, the conversation begins way before Joseph Smith. It begins with the question of if there's a God. Okay. And then
let's agree there's a God, and let's agree that he wants us to know which. Let's do that. He wants to know which church is true. How?
Well, let's agree there's a God.
What makes Mormonism true?
Okay, let's agree with that. Now let's go to the next conclusion that has to be that a person has to arrive at before they even talk about Joseph Smith, and that's that Jesus is the Christ, and that the New Testament.
Let's agree. Jesus is the Christ.
The New Testament narrative is essentially true. Okay.
Let's agree. Okay, sure. Let's agree with that.
Let's agree with that. Okay. So now the discussion, the question now that we're even asking is not about, is about where is Jesus Christ's work today? We're coming from this with those foundations in place. And now I'm looking for Jesus Christ's work in the world. Okay. Now I'm looking at, well, there's competing explanations for what the New Testament Jesus is. The New Testament, I think, very compellingly argues that there was a church. I think the New Testament compellingly argues that that church was endowed with a priesthood hierarchical structure. And so the question then becomes, okay, where is, and I think the New Testament compellingly argues that baptism is required for salvation. And so I want to be baptized.
Have you read the Maxwell Institute's new book of Ancient Christians?
I actually have just barely started it as part of my study this year of the New Testament.
Yeah, what they're essentially saying, and by the way, I think there's tons of evidence for this. The church has always held the claim that Jesus organized the Christian church. Yes. And that the restoration of the church today is done in a restoring of Christ's church as established. And we now know, and again, the church is now coming on board. Two premises aren't true anymore. One is that the experts agree, even inside the church, that Jesus didn't set up a Christian church. He was a Jew inside the Jewish faith.
What do you mean when you say church? What are you talking about?
An organization.
And I can read the New Testament and look at what it says, that he ordained a particular type of structure that existed. Was it exactly synonymous in every way with the way that the church is today? Of course not. But
it wasn't even a separate entity outside of Judaism.
You're right, because I don't think that we are a separate entity outside of Judaism per se. We are Judaism.
If he did it inside of Judaism, how can you create a live branch from a dead tree?
What I mean is that, well, I'll put it this way. And this is a whole other discussion we could have, is that Jesus Christ very clearly established a priesthood hierarchy of authority within the church. Okay. That was what he set up. When I talk about the church, I'm not talking about just a generic body of believers. I am referring to, and neither is the church, we're talking about a specific hierarchy.
They're not today. Maybe they're not today. And they're sort of playing both sides, but they're in the midst of having to reframe their theology on this.
Whatever you think that they're doing, that's fine.
Do you agree, though? No, I'm asking you. Do you
can ask me
that they're right now?
I'm not familiar with their arguments, so I can't really comment on that.
Do you sense, though, the idea behind apostasy and restoration and translation are all fluid right now and shifting?
What is shifting? If they're shifting more towards the truth, I'm all for it. But the truth, as I understand it, is this, and I think that I haven't seen anything to convince me otherwise, is that Jesus Christ established a church, meaning a priesthood hierarchical group who had the authority to administer ordinances of salvation to the faithful and to basically establish a kingdom of God on earth under the authority of the leaders of that group. And that authority structure was perverted and lost over time. And therefore, there was a need to restore the priesthood authority and the structure that came along with it. And the structure today is not exactly the same as it was then, but I don't believe that was I believe that what Jesus Christ was doing was establishing the kingdom of God on earth. And that I believe that the church today is the most likely candidate for that manifestation. I think rationally you can make that case, but I also would say, and I
disagree with that premise. So you have to defend that premise, and
you disagree. So you disagree with the premise that Jesus Christ established a church according to the New Testament narrative.
I disagree with the premise that the LDS church is the closest thing to the organization that Jesus set up. And we also have to
So what is?
Here, let me give me a few more minutes here. I'll make a little note on your paper. I want to make sure I get some time.
That's fine. That's fine. That's fine. I just want to real quick, just to kind of reframe where we were, so we can continue with what you were talking about. I am saying that the Joseph Smith story, of course, is absurdity until you get to actually believe that there are angels, that there are miracles, that God actually. But what I'm saying is,
the trouble is we have to agree with your belief around those things. We have to believe that angels don't have wings, for instance. And now we have to debate whether the people who say angels have wings are more right than the people who say angels don't have wings. And all of that is invisible stuff that's inside our heads, and there's no way to do that. So we have to, again, I don't want to be irrational. And I can't go to Mormonism is true and come to it the way you did unless we can get some legs. We talked about in session 2 having legs underneath the house.
Yeah.
And so the legs are it outside of your internal thought processes and your internal senses that is convincing to me or anyone else outside of you that shows that your beliefs are rational. So bear with me for a moment.
That's fine.
So I don't even need this slide. You've already acknowledged Joseph Smith, at least in those 2 instances.
Yeah, I don't just so you know,
he's not.
Just so you know, there are many things have been said by many church leaders that I think are their personal conjecture and that I don't agree are particular things that are true.
Do you think it's rational? Let me put something else up on the screen. Give me a second here. So share screen. Let's use this. So share. I'm going to put that up. So I created 3 documents: Prophets, Infallibility, a record of Mormon leaders, reversals and abandonment of past teaching. So these are all the things that the church taught at one time and then changed. So we don't really, they've already shown they didn't have the ability on the front end to get it right. They've reversed their position. So their ability to discern truth is hit or miss, and it's significant. So there are 59 of those. Here's the next one. The Mormon Truth Crisis, examining the deception and obfuscation within Mormonism. These are instances in which church leaders seem to be deceptive, dishonest, lying, or obfuscating an issue. This is going to be much longer, I think. I think this one's around 73. Then I've got the Mormon Paradox. These are a list of inconsistencies that challenge faith. For instance, Brigham Young saying that Moroni went from South America, if you believe that's the location, out to Manti to bless the temple, and then to Palmyra to bury the plates. These are impositions. Shiz gets his head cut off and he raises up. Black people were less valued in the pre-orth life. And again, we've disavowed that since then. But these are moments in time where the church holds a position that seems deeply irrational. This one, I think, is 130 something long. So again, for Mormonism to be true, it has to confront these points of view, and it has to have something to offer to say, hey, this isn't absurd to believe in Mormonism, because Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientology do the same thing you're doing, which is go, I don't care about all of that. It's still true anyway. And that is not a way that you can convince anyone who's being a rational thinker. So when I ask,
but remember,
that Nephi built a ship with his family, a small group of people in the Arabian Peninsula, and traveled across the ocean. Let me ask you this one. 2,000 young men.
Hold on here, Bill.
Let me control the conversation for a moment. I let you talk for a while.
I know, but I want to be able to respond to some of this. You're just putting it out there.
I let you throw out 45 minutes of things.
I was waiting for you. I was waiting for you to come back and challenge some of the things they're saying. But you seem to agree with all of it. I wanted to let you set
the groundwork, because I think you created a process to avoid confronting these things. You created your own formula.
You didn't have any problem with that formula.
No, I do, though, because you left out actual using reason, and you made reason somehow not the crux of figuring things out, but rather it's all of this internal sensory stuff. We can use reason. Though you even agreed that reason ultimately is based on the data that you bring into it. And let me have one more, and then I'll let you talk.
That's fine. Okay.
But I want to talk about this one at depth.
All right.
2,000 young men, the stripling warriors, went to battle against a larger, more experienced army. Not a single stripling warrior died. And in that time period, in fact, they suffered wounds so severe that they fainted from blood loss. And yet not a single one died. Not a single one died from infection. Not a single one died in spite of there being no antibiotics or a disinfectant that would have.
I get it, Bill. I know. And if you think I haven't confronted all of these sorts of questions,
my question is, the Book of Mormon, if it's an ancient text, and again, if you're going to say Joseph Smith is making up parts of it, then we have to also go, isn't it most likely that he's making up all of it? So are the stripling warriors real? And did 2,000 of them, or 2,013, because a few were added, did 2,000 of them plus go into battle? And did they make it through a battle with a larger, more experienced army? And do you believe that happened and that none of them died?
I believe that the Book of Mormon, like most scripture, is mythologized history.
Okay. Isn't the most rational answer then, when we take all of these problems into account, that this church is just as made up as Scientology and Jehovah's Witnesses? And if you say no, I need to get to the legs underneath the house.
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Let's
do exactly that.
Why, in spite of all the problems, is Mormonism still true? But when I go into Scientology or Jehovah's Witnesses, it's the very problems themselves that convince me that it's not true.
The problem is that you rejected the very foundations upon which all of this is built. Okay. And we have to go back.
Is this a wood tool though? Would your argument, please, so let's pretend for a minute that.
Oh, hold on, Bill. Bill, can I respond? Let me respond.
Please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like going down the list of this, the thing is you have to understand that you have to go back to the very beginning. We are Christians. Like,
so are Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm going to use them.
You're
at every
right.
turn
And
here.
I would love to have a comparative analysis of Mormonism versus Christianity, and which one actually has a better case for aligning with the New Testament.
That's subjective because it's subjective though, because they believe they also have pieces in the scriptures that mesh with their faith better than other faiths do.
So every faith is just as consistent with the New Testament as every other?
No, but the believers inside the system think so. That's the trouble, Jacob. As
yeah,
a believer inside the
but
system,
we've already agreed though that there's a standard by which we can evaluate if a certain claim is a certain subjective claim, perception of reality is aligned with reality or not. That's what you're doing right now. My point here, Bill, let me build the legs. Let me build the legs here. Okay.
Please.
The legs upon which Mormonism is built is the first leg is the leg of theism. We believe that there is a God in the universe, okay? I believe, and I'll just give you my thing. I believe that it is more rational to believe that there is a God of some kind than that the universe is not. And we diverge there. Like, you disagree there, okay? So only then do I then move on to say, well, where is this God operating in the world? That then takes me to Christianity and the New Testament. And there's a whole conversation we can have about how I get there. The thing is when you're talking about these specific claims, of course they make absolutely no sense. They're utter absurdities. If somebody comes up to me and says that they saw God, like, they're going to have, if I'm an atheist, I just presuppose that God doesn't exist in the first place. So I don't have the necessary foundations to even take the claims seriously. However, if you are a Christian who believes that there are actual scriptures that are written and that there are inspired prophets that exist in the world, you begin to look at this record and go, does this line up consistent with the New Testament conception of scripture? Is it consistent in all of those kinds of things? So I'm at the level 3 conversation as I talk about it. That's where Mormonism exists. You and I diverge at level 1, or even beyond that, at the even level 0, where we just don't even agree about the nature of truth itself, as we had in our last video. What's going on here is that I'm going up this step by step, because what can seem totally unreasonable suddenly seems reasonable when you find out that a certain premise is true. For instance, if we discover that there is a God and that Jesus Christ was the savior of the New Testament and that miracles happen and all those kinds of things, all of a sudden, not saying that that proves that this is true, but what it does is it adds additional premises now that you can make an argument that is reasonable, that may have seemed reasonable if you didn't accept those prior premises. So that's the issue. My whole point is that if you're going to analyze belief, you have to start at the beginning. You're never going to get to any of this making any sense to you unless you've already gone through those prior steps.
How did you arrive at there is a God? What is your legs for that? So that's a premise. That's not that. Now we have to show. So now we have to show how you reasonably came to the position that there is a God.
Certainly. So this is a big shift in the conversation, but I'm happy to have it. So there are variety of arguments for the existence of God. I think that the most compelling for me is it's a version of the fine-tuning argument that has to do with specified complexity. So I'd have to ask you how we could even arrive at the conclusion that there is an intelligent causation to the universe and to reality.
We did that. So I think you listened to me and Spencer Wright have a conversation where we talked about even at the basis forms of life on this planet, that life chose to, again, life did various things. Some amoebas, and again, I'm going back to the whatever the.
I want to go back. I want to go back even further than that. I want to ask conceptually, how do we detect intelligent causation?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that. Again,
well, let me lay it out. That's fine. But to understand is you have to understand the right question, because if we're not asking, if we don't even have a model under which this could be shown to be true, of course you're never going to believe that it's true. So the question is there an intelligent causation to the created order of the universe? Okay, that's the first kind of question when you're exploring, does God exist? Because at the very least, we can define God as an intelligent causation to reality, or to the universe, let's say.
The trouble with this argument, Jacob, is that you have as one of your pillars authority. And for the prevailing opinion.
No, I'm just using reason. I'm not using the authority fallacy here either.
I think you're misunderstanding me.
I value reason over authority, and I don't. Perfect. And I've heard the arguments against fine tuning, but none of them deal with specified complexity.
The trouble, though, with what you're saying is that you have as one of your pillars authority. And what you and I would agree with, even if you would disagree with them, is that by far the prevailing
opinion of the scientific community, because most scientists
believe in God, has their own way in which they make all of this work, and they answer the question to some degree in their heads, whereas you disagree with them, but you're not trusting the authorities who have more expertise than you and would know this field better than you.
Real quick, Bill.
Yeah,
I know exactly what you're saying. I know what the authorities say, but the authorities presuppose metaphysical naturalism. Okay, they presuppose a particular view of the world that obviously leads them to those conclusions. What I'm arguing here is I'm making an argument from reason. Okay. And no, I don't presuppose metaphysical naturalism. I'm open to the possibility that metaphysical naturalism is not true. So here's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that in reality, there exists intelligent design. There exists intelligence. And the way that we can detect intelligent design is through something called specified complexity. This is, I believe, the strongest argument to be made. So let me make it. The way it works is this. Specified complexity is not just all the universe is complex. There are going to be people listening. I can already hear them. They're going to be like, oh, you just think because it's complex, that means it has to be created by a designer. No, that's not what I'm saying. Okay. Complexity can be designed or it can be random. So talking about complexity, let's use the example of a license plate. Okay. Bill, if you saw a license plate that was 1372BB, do you know what the chances are of getting that license plate, that exact series of numbers? It's like 1 in a bajillion, right? Like it's super unlikely that you're going to get that set of numbers. That is a complex set of numbers in the sense that it is unlikely to occur randomly, let's say, right? You're unlikely to get that set of numbers, but none of us look at that and say that that is anything but just a random set of numbers that appeared. The thing is this, what if you get a license plate that its series of numbers happens to conform to your birthday? Now, the most rational explanation of that would be that it was caused by an intelligent agent, because you have two independent.
I don't agree with that premise.
So if you saw real quick, then let me clarify here. So you're saying that if you got a license plate that came in the mail that had your your birthday on it, like the exact numbers, you think the most likely explanation for that is that it just was random.
So you're conflating two different problems. So one, if it's a license plate that comes in the mail that has my birthday, yeah, I'm going to call that coincidence, because those kinds of coincidences do happen that have nothing to do with religion or God or whatever. The other thing too is that let's up the ante then. Let's say that your wife then gets one and it comes in and it has her birthday on it. And then your kid gets one and it has their birthday on it. At what point, Bill, are you going to say this isn't just a coincidence? Sure. At some point, it's the person at the DMV playing games or
Okay,
something.
okay.
Sure.
Real quick. I'm just saying, my point isn't my thing is that at some point, there's a level of improbability to something when you have two independently given patterns. One pattern is the pattern of the numbers themselves, right? But then there's this other pattern known as your birthdays, right? These are independent patterns. And the fact that this series of numbers, where any given number is really unlikely, but to have it conform to an independent pattern is something that then says, this is evidence of design. Just so you know, Bill, this is scientific. This is what they do in the SETI program. The SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, is a search for patterns in nature that are not just random patterns, but that conform to some independently given pattern, because that is the best way to detect intelligent causation. The same thing that archaeologists do. If you see a stone pillar, you could say, well, it was just caused by sand and wind and rain, but it's perfectly shaped and things like that. And the reason we infer that it was designed and that it was not purely random chance is because the independently given pattern of a house, for instance, this conforms to it, and natural causation will produce patterns, but it doesn't produce patterns that match this other pattern that we know through experience is what a house looks like. So real quick, this is how you detect intelligent causation. Okay. You find two independently given patterns that match up, and that gives you evidence for causation. Now, the question is, when we look at the constants and the parameters of our universe, they conform to an independently given pattern that didn't have to exist, namely the conditions necessary to have life. You could have had a universe that had any series of patterns in it, but it gave us the pattern that produces life. So the question is, out of all of the different possible universes that could have been created, why is it that we inhabit a universe where we exist and are having this conversation? Why does the universe have order at all? These are fundamental questions that I believe a theistic worldview gives a better accounting for that existing data than does any other explanation. And I've listened to the naturalistic explanations that ultimately have to rely on wild hypotheses that have nothing to do with our experience about multiverses that are, there's an infinite number, and therefore anything that's possible happens. And it's absurd. So anyway, that's
okay. I'm missing.
Let me just sum up. That is the, if we're starting at the very base level of how do you start to get up this level of God, that's at least where the conversation can start. And there are very good rational explanations for why a person could believe in God.
Yeah, I disagree with the premise because you're right. I can't get back to the very beginning. And you're also right. You're hinting at this idea that we could argue that there are multiple universes. They collapse on each other. New ones start. Even if there was a God, he could have been dead a long time ago, whatever God means. Also being, and again, I don't agree that there is a God, but if there is, it still doesn't mean that Mormonism's true.
Absolutely not.
And then when you say like, well, yeah, but the Mormon church most encapsulates the New Testament church. Well, because Mormonism is created after the fact, all it would take would be somebody to sit down with the scriptures and come up with the best. So if I sat down and came up with the best example of a church that most closely follows Christ's church, now I have the best church that most closely follows it. But because I'm doing it after the fact, I've got the cheat sheet, which is I'm reading the New Testament. Hence, Joseph Smith, as we well know, was very familiar with the scriptures. And for him to create a church that's similar to the New Testament church doesn't prove anything.
What's wild is actually, what's wild is how far Joseph Smith, of the experts of his day, all of the theologians of his day, one of the, I think the biggest testimonies that I have of Joseph Smith was his theological innovations that were able to solve the problems that plagued Christianity for centuries. And in fact, I would say the reason I'm a Latter-day Saint, the reason I'm a Christian is different from the reason I'm a Latter-day Saint. The reason I'm a Latter-day Saint, I would say amongst the top things, is the compelling theology that actually is rationally coherent when compared to other Christian explanations that have existed over time.
That's a wood tool, because people from all kinds of religions suggest such. And even if it was true,
well, then make
if
the
Joseph
argument.
Smith's making it up, he's allowed to come up with answers to things. So later, let's do another one real quick here. The lost 116 pages. Let's use our rational thinking. While Joseph Smith claimed to have had supernatural ability to use a seer stone to find lost items and to discern God's mind and will and to translate the Book of Mormon, he seemingly couldn't use that to locate the lost 116 pages. It seems irrational that the 116 pages weren't retranslated according to Joseph's reasoning. If he retranslated 116 pages and the old ones reemerged, and not even that they have to match, they would just have to be extremely similar. I think most decent people who think with their minds would make room that not every single word would have to be the same, but the story would have to at least be coherent with the other one. It would have to have a lot of overlap, right? If he retranslated the 116 pages and the old ones reemerged and matched, it would have proven he was a prophet.
Yeah,
the original 116 pages.
This is the old South Park episode. Like I know what the argument is. It's that why couldn't he have retranslated the 116 pages? It's obviously this is evidence. Obviously, Bill, I agree with you. This is evidence against Joseph Smith, 100%.
I would agree that the critical rational thinker would go, there's really not a good logical reason for why he played this out the way he did.
Yeah, 100%. Now here's my thing. Is there now, but I want to, we can look at all of the evidence against the church.
Do you believe the Tower of Babel is a literal story?
Hold on, Bill.
Please.
Let's balance this out here a little bit.
Because you're picking and choosing which things of Joseph Smith you hold up as these make me so excited that the church is true, but then you don't really want to throw in the bag.
No,
all of these problems.
Believe me, I'm aware of the evidences against the Joseph Smith story. Remember, you're looking only at the negative evidence. So let's
I'm looking at both.
Well, real quick. So what is the most rational explanation for all of the congruent things that happen in the Old Testament or in the Old World geography in the beginning of First Nephi? Joseph's, like, what is the chance that you find a place that has all of the things in Bountiful? What are the chances of you finding finding Nahum and finding, and it happens at exactly the spot where you expect the turn to happen in the road? What are there are so many other evidences. If we were to just line up evidences for and against the church, which, by the way, I've done, Bill, it's not like I'm unaware of all these things that you're bringing up. What I'm saying, though, is that we can take a look at the evidence for and the evidence against. And what I arrive at on a purely rationalistic basis is that I believe that there is
a logical basis, not rationalistic.
Fine. I would argue rational. Is that what I'm looking at here is that there is a bunch of evidence for and against, and that and I'm not saying that a solid case against. There are good reasons to doubt the story of Joseph Smith. However, I believe that the preponderance of the evidence is there, and I do believe that the other things that undergird this, the fact that I believe that there is a God, the fact that I believe that Jesus Christ was who the New Testament made him out to be, still leaves this imperfect story with its own doubts and issues as the best explanation of what Jesus Christ is doing today.
I don't agree with your premise. And
you don't agree with the premise that God exists.
No, but anytime I lay out, so here's the trouble. Mormonism can't afford to get half of its stuff right. It has to get a certain number of things. It makes truth claims, and it's being true depends on those claims.
You're saying that every single thing the church has ever said and anything Joseph ever did or said has to be right and true?
No. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there has to be at least some degree of things holding up. And if we went through every one of the church's truth claims, I almost feel like you would agree with me that on a rational level, a whole bunch of them wouldn't add up. Do you agree with that?
All of them wouldn't add up if you reject the idea of God and Jesus Christ. You have to remember, Bill,
hold on, you're creating a false argument.
Well, what you're doing here, and I can see exactly what you're doing, and it's fine. You're saying, look at all these things in Mormonism from an atheistic perspective and how they don't make any sense. But if I were to say, now, Bill, do this, let's accept the New Testament is true, and then Now let's start to look at these things.
No,
And you're right, there's still challenges, but there's a ton of other evidence that you're not mentioning here that actually supports the idea that that Joseph Smith is a prophet of God, because even the Bible itself talks about the need for prophets and the way that prophets operate and all that kind of stuff. You've rejected it's like you're mad about the calculus when you've rejected algebra and arithmetic. You have to have accepted
not apples and apples.
But you haven't, that is the thing though, Bill. Our disagreement is not at the level of Mormonism. It's at the level of basic theism.
Okay, so I'll just, for the sake of argument, let's agree that there's a Christian God and Christ is real. Okay. I still have to deal with the fact that Mormon prophets seem unable to discern truth. And I would list the examples and you would agree with me. I would
put this at that Mormon prophets have gotten certain things wrong. Fine.
A lot of things wrong.
All right.
Okay. I think, and again, if we went through the list, you would agree with me. So a lot of things wrong. So Mormon prophets don't seem to be dependable to discern truth from error.
I would disagree.
Okay. How did they do on race? How did they do on the causes of homosexuality? How did they do on knowing what the apostasy was?
If they had
knowing exactly what the restoration was? How did they do on knowing what Joseph Smith's translation mode and ability were? How did they know? How good did they do on knowing how Joseph translated the revision of the Bible and what that actually was?
If you think that the purpose of the gospel is for our leaders to reveal to us all and every historical fact with perfect accuracy,
I just want them to be right when they think they're right. At least most of the time.
And I believe me, I will take with a grain of salt things that they say when they talk about things that maybe are outside of their scope of understanding. But what it really comes down to is, what is their level of knowledge when it comes to spiritual fulfillment and human flourishing? And
that's a wood tool, because a Jehovah's Witness would say the same thing.
No, a Jehovah's Witness does not have the same amount. Their outcomes that they have are not comparable to those of Latter-day Saints.
Oh boy.
And and atheists, as we pointed out last time, that human thriving is very clearly predicated on or is much more correlated with a belief in God and a belief in a higher power. And furthermore, I can't find anything that does better for human beings in Christianity and the Christian ethic. And then within Christianity, I can't find anything that does better within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So if you want to go through and argue and throw on the wall, as people like Jeremy Runnels do, where you just throw up every possible problem without examining what we're actually about and doing, is that we are seeking to follow Jesus Christ. Okay. So, and I can't find any group of leaders on earth that are more, that are doing a better job of aligning people with Jesus Christ. I don't go to the prophets of the church for history. I go to the prophets of the church to learn the ways of life and salvation that Jesus Christ want me to know. And in that respect,
Savage says the same thing, though.
I know they say the same thing, but the outcomes, if we go back to the epistemology that I talked about, the outcomes are demonstrably better. The rationale of Latter-day Saints is objectively better than that of Jehovah's Witnesses. And intuitively, I would say that I have received a witness from God. I truly believe that God has revealed to me that this is where I need to be and what to do. And can I
steel man you for a moment?
I can't convey that. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me steel man you. That in spite of prophets being deeply hit or miss and often holding bad ideas for significant periods of time, multiple men, generation after generation, I still think they're prophets. In spite of Joseph Smith, as I agree, he is making up or adding in fictional story, which explains why.
Hold on, are you steel manning Hill? Are you steel manning here? Because I want to go back to then. Can I correct something? Because there was a straw man in there. I do not agree with the premise that the leaders of the church have gotten all these things wrong. I believe that they're fallible, but I believe on the issues that actually matter, on the issues related to the way to live my life in accordance with Jesus Christ, because I'm operating from that presupposition that Jesus Christ is or not the presupposition, but from the premise that Jesus Christ was who the New Testament claimed to be. I look at them to help me to live in accordance with Jesus Christ. And I don't believe that anyone out there does a better job of helping men and women to align with Jesus Christ than them. And so the
Have Mormon
standard by which
prophets been accurate on the Godhead throughout its history?
definitely
Have
more
Mormon,
so.
again, the important issue. So I'm gonna go to Adam God.
Okay.
I'll just tell you ahead of time.
Yeah, Brigham was
Did
wrong
Mormon
about that. That's fine.
Do Mormon prophets have a consistent record of laying out exactly what the Godhead is, including Joseph Smith and like the lectures on faith, or Brigham Young's teaching of Adam God? Do the early leaders
Yeah, I would say that our understanding of God, for the most part, has been better than any other group out there that puts it out, and it is more rationally coherent.
You're not answering my question, though.
You're asking for it, but what you're doing is you're trying to say that, hey, look, there was a time where somebody had an idea that wasn't right, and therefore they're totally unreliable. Right? Like I could do this with scientists. If you look at the scientists historically, were they right about
apples
XYZ?
and oranges?
No, it isn't. Because
this is the creator of the universe telling us that we shouldn't drink coffee, but seemingly struggling to tell Brigham Young what he and the rest of the Godhead was. That seems so fundamental to whether this is true or not. And it seems like you want to discard any moment where I show that Mormonism is irrational, and I'll show it in 5,000 places. You want to kind of nod to it like, yeah, you're right, but it doesn't matter. And what I'm
saying when I nod to the thing is you're just bringing up the things in the church that at times you're correct that they got wrong or where they were fallible or whatever.
Did Brigham Young get the Godhead wrong?
Yeah, well, when it came to the Adam God theory, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm not super familiar with all of his theological teachings as to the nature of the Godhead, but there were already apostles within the church that were saying that he had it wrong.
Did the early leaders get free agency wrong, or is the modern church getting moral agency wrong?
Let's back this up. Okay. First of all, let's compare Latter-day Saints to general Christianity. Do we have a more rationally coherent theology of God and the Godhead than do the Trinitarians?
That's what you're suggesting is an opinion. No, and the only way we can evaluate the opinion is to go step by step, which we're not going to be able to do here.
No, you can demonstrably show in a debate, as I've done with people, that the Trinity is a rationally inferior explanation of God and the New Testament than is the Godhead as we present it. Okay.
Didn't the first edition of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith's early theology hold a Trinitarian view?
That's debatable. That's really debatable. We're gonna have a whole debate about that. And frankly, I would say no. I think
so. It seems as though most of the experts in this field would disagree with you that
if you just want to appeal to authority, that's fine. Reason in my mind trumps authority. Okay. If a person makes a better rational argument, then I will go with reason over what the authority says, because reason an authority should be able to provide me with good reasons. Okay. Yeah. If they can't, then I'm not going to just blindly follow them. So my point here is that if you want to do like you're doing right now and just put up a list of every possible question about Mormonism and say, is this rational? Is this rational? You can make a really good list. I don't deny that. But I also think I can make a big list of things that say, if you are a believing Christian, especially, and we go through this, does Mormonism make sense from that perspective? And it absolutely does. And especially if you ask the question, does it make more sense than all of the other worldviews that are out there available to someone who holds to New Testament Christianity? And I think that we have a very strong case, but it has to come from that premise. If you're just approaching it from an atheist perspective, say, hey, everybody, let's deny that there's a God. Let's deny that Jesus Christ was who the New Testament makes him out to be, and let's just examine this from a materialist perspective, a metaphysical materialist perspective. Of course, it's like you haven't crossed the first hurdle. You don't get to Joseph Smith until you've made sense of the other things and why those things are rational to believe, and that provides you with the premises upon which you can make the arguments for Joseph Smith.
You're blending two sets of arguments together. You've created your own flow chart that ends with the church being true, but you're not really dealing with these issues the way critical thinkers do. So again, I'll just establish.
No, I am. I just have different premises that I'm bringing to the table.
Fine,
Remember, a critical thinker, the whole nature of the argument changes when you establish that there's a God and that Jesus Christ. Suddenly, your
even
critical
if I agree
thinking.
To those, I still don't
so you
think you have a way to make it
you
work.
think Aquinas was not a critical thinker?
No, you're missing what I'm saying.
You think William Lane Craig is not a critical thinker? The thing is there are critical thinkers.
They're not Mormon, are they?
You're right, but what I'm saying is that what I'm saying is that
in other words, they don't agree with you.
I know, Bill.
Yeah.
What I'm saying, though, is that you can have people that are critical thinkers that can use reason to arrive at different conclusions, but it depends on the premises that you bring to the table.
But you have to show your premises to be reasonable and rational. So
yes,
again,
it is reasonable and rational to believe that there is a God, and I will debate that with you. I'd be happy to.
Okay, but
that's where our
none of that leads to Mormonism. For sure,
it does. It doesn't lead to it for sure, but it's very simple. It is more reasonable or rational to believe in God than not. It is more reasonable and rational, if you believe in God, to believe in Christ as the manifestation of that God than the alternatives. And then I would say that amongst Christian thought, that therefore from there, it is more rational to believe in the Joseph Smith narrative than the other narratives that are out there to explain where Christianity is supposed to be today.
You've made that point over and over. Let me say that when I go into the collective history of the church, I find that Joseph's multiple translation productions, including, because we've covered it, they have deep implications, the Kinderhook plates and the Greek Psalter. But aside from those, the Book of Abraham, the Book of Mormon, the Book of Moses, the Bible translation, all of those come to buy into Mormonism. We have to buy that a very different mode of translation is happening in all of them. Some of them, it's a secular translation of some sort. Some of them, it's a catalyst theory. Some of them, it's an ancient record that Joseph's working with directly. We've created ways in which we tackle each problem isolated, but that when we look at the collective view, the most rational view is that Joseph wasn't translating at all, even to the point where you agree. But hold on. Let me get it out. We could go through hundreds of statements of church leaders that show that they seem to be highly deceptive and dishonest about how they share and teach church history.
See, Bill, I have to disagree though, because I don't agree with those things. I don't agree that the church is highly deceptive and they do all these terrible things. What I think you're doing is you're selecting the things.
This is where reason comes in. We can go through them.
You're right.
So
you can take if you take
150
if you take 150 years of history, you can find things that people have done wrong, or that or
aren't these serious though? Don't these point to an integrity issue among the leadership? For instance,
no, not when you account for all of the rest of the data. See, the thing is Bill, what you're doing here is you've selected very narrow particular data. What I'm saying is I've seen the data, Bill. I know the things you're talking about. What I'm saying is you're not considering the other things. You're not considering theism. You're not considering Christianity.
No, I'm just dealing with the integrity of the leaders right now.
But here's the thing. The amount of data that's out there, with the integrity of the leaders. I mean, I could go to D. Michael Quinn, who was excommunicated, who I made a whole video on, where he basically says, look, the church's finances.
I've been doing this 10 years. Tell me 3 lies that I've told. I've been doing this work for 10 years.
Bill,
anybody,
I haven't listened.
I haven't listened on Jacob's channel or here.
I haven't listened
because
to
you know why?
stuff.
You're not going to find it. You're not going to find where I have intentionally lied 3 times.
I'll leave that to the Midnight Mormons to try and dig through your stuff and find stuff.
But my point is, if I'm more honest than church leadership over a 10-year span, any one of them, Elder Holland, double-digit state creation every week of our lives, Elder President Nelson with the plane story. You know that the plane story he highly embellished. You also know that the thing in Mozambique didn't happen the way he said, and he had to retract the book over the red hat. He's told more lies in the last whatever than I have in 10 years of doing this, for sure. Elder Holland, the same. These guys have an integrity issue, Jacob, and you want to make excuses for it, but it is demonstrable that Elder Oaks with the electroshock therapy, that was a dishonest. These guys don't want to tell the truth. So once I point out, let's use me.
If you and the thing is, I don't agree with the things you're saying. The thing is, you're throwing all sorts of mud against the wall, and unless we're going to get into something specific, then
let's do specific. The electroshock therapy.
Bill.
Oh, you just said it.
I'm not even aware. I'm not totally versed on that subject. So here's my thing. If we're going to discuss a particular subject, we have to delve into something particular. What you're doing in this podcast is
plenty of subjects I haven't read enough about. You're choosing your own rules. You're creating a rule book where you get to throw out things that I'm not versed in well, and I've sat with, and I go like, yeah, you're right there. And just look, Elder Oaks was at BYU as the president of BYU when the electroshock therapy started. He claims that by the time he got there, it was gone. Is that true?
Bill, I don't even know. I'm not familiar with that. My point is that you can sit there and nitpick every little thing with the leaders because of a deep disdain for Mormonism. Hold on, Bill. What I'm saying is that you're missing the point of the conversation. We're having a conversation.
So their integrity doesn't really matter.
No, it does matter. But what I'm saying is that these issues that seem so big can become much smaller when you take into account all of the data. What you've done is you're being very selective in the data that you present, and you basically pick all of the bad things and then you line them all up. What needs to happen is there needs to be an analysis from the ground up, from God to Jesus Christ, then to the church. And at best, what you're doing here, just so you know, for me, is that you're convincing me that these guys aren't the prophets of Jesus Christ. And by the way, I don't think that you're right. I think you're totally wrong, and I have lots of reasons why, but that's a separate discussion about the reliability of prophets.
No, it's a multifold problem, Jacob. If I can show that the integrity of the leaders is deeply questionable, that the more rational answer is that these guys have no problem lying whenever it's convenient for them. If I can show that Joseph Smith's translation productions look like they're a 19th century production, if I can show that that there are many paradoxes within Mormon belief.
Bill, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying is if you list off every possible little critique that you can have of the church, fine, little and big critique, whatever. That's what anti-Mormons have been doing for forever, Bill.
No, I know, but that's what anti-Jehovah's Witnesses are doing forever. That's what anti-Scientologists have been doing forever. That's a wood tool.
What I'm saying is yes, I know. We know about these things. Hammering them over and over doesn't do anything.
No. Most people don't know about these things. Most believers don't.
Is that what needs to happen is that what we need to look at what do we believe in here? Okay. And where is the disconnect? Okay. I get it. You don't believe in Mormonism. You think they're unreliable. We know that. What I'm trying to go to
are they unreliable though? Reason can show that they actually are unreliable. Let me give you an here.
Are they
the last 50 years?
Yes, you can make that case if you're pulling every quote that they have from all over time.
I'm going to do
what
something
I'm
different.
saying though, Bill, is that in this conversation, okay, which was supposed to be about testimony, we've gotten way off track.
No, it's actually it's 100% about testimony, because the way in which you get to the church is true is somehow to conflate and dismiss all of this. And I know you say like you know it, but you don't actually want to confront it.
No, Bill. I'm aware of all of it. What I'm saying though, the thing is if you want to do a debate on, is it rational for a Christian to believe in Mormonism? Like, fine, we can, like, that's a discussion to have.
Let me ask a different question.
But the thing is
that the last 50 years, hold on, the last 50 years, what is the substantial revelation that the church has given that couldn't rationally be explained as a corporate business with 15 men at the top just doing their thing? And the 1978 revelation, by the way, I hope you don't use that one, because they would essentially be being corrected on being wrong for 200 years. That would seem strange. But I would love to hear what, in the last 50 years, what have Mormon prophets, seers, and revelators given us that couldn't rationally be explained otherwise, so that I can overlook these problems and still see God's hand?
Well, I would say that I would say that you're framing the question as rational according to your presuppositions that you bring to the table. So there's no answer I'm going to give you that would satisfy you, because you reject the idea that
Forget
Jesus.
me. Listen to the
Okay,
people. There's
hold
people
on.
that are watching.
Let's do this. So let me do this then.
Yeah.
I would say if you're a Christian, okay, the church's revelation related to, well, all of the church's revelations, I think, are evidence that the church is connected to the Jesus Christ of the New Testament and doing his work. And I believe people can get a testimony of that, as the New Testament describes, by praying to God. But I would use the family proclamation as something wildly prophetic, in the sense that it is going against the prevailing culture of our day, very much so. And it is true. It is, when it came out in I remember when the family proclamation came out, I was like, this is the most boring thing ever. Like, duh, like, who doesn't believe this? And now all of a sudden, everything in it is controversial. And I believe that that was indeed prophetic. And I believe that the Lord was preparing us and giving to his people what we are willing to receive, in order to stay aligned with what the biblical teachings and what Jesus teaches in relation to the nature of family and gender.
Yeah, so we can go into using rational thinking, look at the family proclamation, when we can see that it was used to create a friend of the court amicus brief, so that the church could then participate in the conversation about homosexuality. So, but let's set that one off to the side. Perfect. Thank you. Family proclamation. Let's go some more. Revelations from prophets, seers, and revelators over the last 50 years.
I'm not expecting there to be these wild new pronouncements that are given by them. I believe that well, why are we just going 50 years? Why don't we use the entire restoration of the church? Things like the 3 degrees of glory, I think, make way more sense.
From Emanuel Swedenborg, right? Again, rational thinking shows that those kinds of ideas already existed in Joseph Smith's milieu.
It's regardless of what existed in Joseph Smith's milieu. The reality is that they make a much. The thing is if it's true or not. Okay. And does it accord?
Jehovah's Witnesses get something true because they take something from other sources and contemporary milieu of those leaders, then that makes them inspired.
Bill, do you want to go and real quick, can you pull up a slide that actually it talks about this exact thing, right? Again, going back to epistemology. If you go to slide number 20.
I'm going to, by the way, I'm going to gather here that you realize that you sort of can't really name revelations that would indicate that these men actually talked to God in the last 50 years.
No, I believe that they do have communion with God, just like Joseph Smith did and the others. I just don't believe that God is constantly revealing at the same rate to everyone all the time. I believe that there are things that God reveals, and that he reveals it in different ways to different people. Joseph Smith was a very special prophet in our tradition because he...
It is, though. You're making a reason that works with any church. Do you understand?
It doesn't.
Wood tools and steel tools.
I haven't watched the whole episode. I'd love to talk to you about that.
So the idea is that when you come up with reasoning that would work within any church that keeps somebody going like, oh yeah, Jacob answered it, I'm going to stay Mormon. The answers that you're giving just now would work inside any faith. So you have to come up with something unique, because Mormonism is the true church and the rest of them are not.
Real quick, pull up slide number 20. So I want to, this is something that Joseph Smith said. He said, the first and fundamental principle of our holy religion is that we believe that we have a right to embrace all and every item of truth without limitation or without being circumscribed or prohibited by the creeds or superstitious notions of men. If you go up to slide number 19, Brigham Young said, in a word, if Mormonism is not my life, I do not know that I have any. I do not understand anything else, for it embraces everything that comes within the range of the understanding of man. If it does not circumscribe everything that is in heaven and on earth, it is not what it purports to be. If you want to go up one more to slide 18.
By the way,
real quick, let's
just Mormonism doesn't actually do this.
Real quick, please continue to go up. I'll get to, let me just finish the point real quick. President Nelson says, "Dear brothers and sisters, God is the source of all truth. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints embraces all truth that God conveys to his children, whether learned in a scientific laboratory or received by direct revelation from him." So my point here is that to say that we are the true church does not mean that other churches do not have truth in them, or that there is not truth to be learned outside of it.
Of course.
It
Even
is,
if Mormonism isn't true, it has some truth in it, sure.
but here's my point. So the fact that you're saying we're the one true church, what that means, Bill, is that we believe that we are the church that has the priesthood authority that Jesus Christ gave to his original apostles, and that through that authority, people can enter into covenant relationship with God. But again, to you, Bill, none of this makes any sense. You're just not in the same conversation because you don't accept accept the presupposition of Christianity.
That's fine.
My whole point is that our disagreement is much deeper. And so if you're going to say, like, you're not going to see the evidences in favor of the church because you reject Christianity generally and theism generally. And the thing is, if you were to believe in God and in Jesus Christ, then suddenly there's a whole new world of possible evidences for you to consider, including the witness of the Spirit from God. And so if you reject the very possibility that God can talk to you, and you've already said, if God appeared in the room to you right now, you would believe that was a hallucination before you were to believe that it was actually God.
That'd be a reasonable option on the table. And I would have to examine whether, again, I would have to explore reasonably what could be or what couldn't be. I'm open. If an angel comes into the room right now, I'm open to that. But I'm also going to have doubts about it too. I'm going to be skeptical. I'm going to trust but verify.
Yeah, but the thing is, there's nothing that you could do to verify that even if God himself appeared to you, that wasn't a hallucination.
Yeah, to a degree you're true, but there are ways in which you can weed out the obvious reasons for why it wouldn't be, right?
You're right, but what I'm saying is that there's something more fundamental going on here, Bill. In you, you have chosen particular values and you have chosen particular ways of seeing the world that prevent you from being able to even see the things that we're seeing.
That goes both directions, Jacob.
And to some extent, I think that you're right in the sense that the presuppositions that we bring to the table, that everyone brings to the table, changes the way that they see the world. If you go back to that Stephen Covey slide, that is what he's saying. He's saying that you, Bill, are seeing the world as you are, right? And so the question is what is the way of being in the world that opens you to the most truth possible? And what I'm saying is that the Latter-day Saint conception of epistemology and of testimony and of taking in truth from wherever it comes allows us to see everything. But if you limit yourself, as you have, to the naturalistic, materialistic view of reality as the only thing that constitutes reality, of course, all of this is absurd. And not only that, you can make big fat lists of things of why they're all wrong about this and that. And it totally seems unreasonable, but that's only because you're unable to see the other evidences, including the witness of God himself to you, that is even possible rationally, unless you embrace those other premises.
So we're at 1232. It seems as though we're kind of at the point where we're just bumping up against each other. And
yeah, I think so.
Probably the best thing to do is just to give each other a chance to give kind of a closing thought of one side of the argument without being interrupted. And I'm happy to let you pick if you want me to go first or if you want to go first.
You go ahead and go first.
Okay. So in the world of religious belief, there is lots of different institutions that claim to be the authority or have the truth within Christianity and outside of it. And when we talk about testimony, we're talking about testimony from a Mormonism point of view, which requires, at least on some level, that you trust the emotional answers, at least as part of the formula, if not a significant part. And so for folks who are listening, who are open to having your mind changed one way or the other, whether you started off as a disbeliever or you started off as a believer, and you really do want to get at what is true and what isn't, you need to recognize that there are believers inside of every spiritual system who have experiences that tell them that their spiritual system is true. So, for instance, Jonathan Haidt, who Jacob Hansen brought up earlier, is the person who really expounded on the idea of elevation emotion. If you go to Wikipedia and you look up elevation emotion, it is described very similar, almost identical to the way that Mormon leaders explain how the Holy Ghost tells someone that the church is true. And so all human beings feel these feelings of burnings in our bosom and hair standing up on our neck. And all of us feel thoughts come into our mind about peace and wanting to be more helpful in the world. So to arrive at whether Mormonism is true or not, you have to do something other than pray about it, because lots of other people in lots of other spiritual systems are sure that they're right because they felt things after praying or after asking God. So what we have to do is we have to use critical thinking skills, and we have to go into the system and see if its truth claims hold up. Mormonism has claimed a lot of things. It's claimed things about the apostasy. It's claimed things about the restoration. It's claimed things about translation. It's claimed things about who Joseph Smith was, what his integrity was, who Brigham Young was, how Brigham Young took over the church, for instance. When you look at the integrity of leaders, and I would suggest, folks, by the way, do me a favor, be open to changing your mind. Go on to MormonDiscussionPodcast.org. In the top right of the header, there is a link that says helpful resources. Go into the 3 documents I put there. And again, these 3 documents are the number of times the church has stated with certainty that it knew how God's kingdom worked, only to later disavow, reverse, dismiss, get away from those claims, which shows that Mormon prophets have some sort of barrier to getting it right. And often they don't get it right until the world forces them. Again, the lost and fallen world forces them to change. The second one is instances in which church leaders have been deceptive or dishonest. Go into that document and read all of those and begin to comprehend how far spread church leaders' dishonesty and deception goes. The third one is Mormon paradoxes. These are things that the church has claimed about how the church works, in which when you think about those problems logically, again, Jacob used to believe that the stripling warriors were real and that that story was true. And it wasn't until his critical thinking mind told him that that story couldn't possibly be true, that it, with 100 other stories, forced Jacob to retreat to some softer ground that no longer requires the Book of Mormon to be completely an ancient text. Those are called adding conjecture and inferences and allowances. And there comes a point where if you're going to be the true church of Jesus Christ upon the earth, a certain number of your claims have to hold up. And if you touch on those 3 documents and go through them, you recognize that the church being true is irrational. But you get to decide whether you still want to believe it or not. And you can't use emotional experiences to be the final straw for your testimony, because Jonathan Haidt, who Jacob mentioned, already tells you that that's part of the human experience and can be manipulated anyway. And so there is a lot at stake. And if you were born into Mormonism and you're so sure that the church is true, what is the possibility that you're no different than the Jehovah's Witness or the Scientologist, who's also born into their system, also sees all the same kinds of problems that I'm pointing out with Mormonism, and then does the same thing that Jacob's doing, which is go, yes, I agree, there's problems, but in the end, they don't matter. If we start with the presupposition that God is real and Jesus is the Christ, then obviously the Jehovah's Witness Church is the best representation of his faith. Once you do all that, if you can take a step back and recognize what other people in other systems frame their beliefs the exact same way, please sense that you're making excuses for why you believe that don't actually deal with the problems, the absurdities, the reversals, or the integrity of one's leadership. Thank you.
All right. Real quick, Bill, could you go to slide number 7, just so I think that would be a helpful visual as I kind of wrap up here. Perfect. Thank you. So interesting. It's kind of tough here, and thanks, Bill, for having me on. This discussion was originally supposed to be about testimony ultimately. And Bill and I had kind of agreed when we were going to have these conversations that it wasn't supposed to be a debate. It was supposed to be a discussion where we kind of, explore each other's points of view. And one of the things is that I don't think Bill and I had any disagreement about how we come to know the nature of reality. However, at least in the first part. But then in the second half of this, Bill basically was just asking over and over, is this rational? Is this rational? Is this rational? Is this rational? But the problem is that Bill is basing what he thinks as rational on its reasonableness according to the premises that he brings to the table. As we discussed in the earlier part of this video, your reason is going to be changed based on the data that you take in. And because Bill has not taken in the data that God exists and that Jesus Christ is who the New Testament makes him out to be, of course, the Joseph Smith story is not reasonable. It's not reasonable at all. It's kooky nonsense. Like, yeah, we know. But the thing is that we're Christians. We're theists. We're believers, right? And we believe in God first. That's where we arose. And I would say you can get there purely rationally. In fact, that's how I did. I do not presuppose God. I arrived at the belief that there is a God, that there is a higher power. And then I arrived at the belief utilizing these tools of outcomes, intuition, sense data, reason, authority, all of them. I used these in order to arrive at Christianity. And then once you arrive at Christianity, there's a set of premises that are there that then allow you to be able to evaluate Mormonism and actually see the evidences for it. The problem is Bill can make a big fat list of all of the evidences against the church, but he is unable to see or unwilling to see, either because of biases or otherwise, the evidence in favor of the church. And so what you have is a biased analysis that hasn't taken into account the premises that we've talked about as believers in God and Jesus Christ. The reality is that Bill and I have a difference of opinion, but it isn't at the level of Mormonism. And in fact, if Bill were to believe in God and to believe in Jesus Christ, we could have a much more interesting conversation about Mormonism, where Mormonism could be shown to be more reliable. That isn't to say that there aren't things that are problematic or challenging or evidences against our belief system or things that they got wrong. Those generally they fit into the categories of either someone is fallible and they goofed up, or it's a misrepresentation by Bill where he's trying to expand something and to be something bigger than it is. But again, if we're going to pull let's just throw a million things against the wall, that's not a productive way of having the conversation. You have to get specific. And when we get specific, like into the issue of does God exist, where the actual disagreement is, that's where I think the interesting conversations can happen. And ultimately, what a person thinks is reasonable, okay, which is what Bill is coming down to, or rational, is based on the data that you put into it. Rationality is not the most fundamental, as Jonathan Haidt points out. It is a post hoc justification for your deeper intuitive senses. Bill and many like him have faced these very difficult faith crises that have been an experience that has caused them to have an emotional reaction to the church. And it is because of this deeper intuitive experience that they have within them that they then go and utilize the tools of reason against the church. But the tools of reason can be used in favor of the church as well, and you can make a very good case for it. Now, ultimately, making that case is its own thing. So in kind of closing here, Bill and I have not had... This unfortunately sounds like a debate because we're both giving closing statements here. In the future, though, maybe we can actually debate some of these subjects, because at the end of the day, we have fundamental disagreements. And it's very difficult to have a conversation about what you disagree about without it ultimately turning into where you're kind of debating it anyway. So, just to sum up, when it comes to knowledge, knowledge is ultimately about the witnesses that we allow in. I believe that, as was said by our prophet, Joseph Smith, that we are allowed to embrace all items of truth. We don't need to close our eyes to our intuition, to outcomes, to sense data, to reason, or to authority. We can take in truth from wherever it comes. And I believe that if you follow the path, theism, you'll arrive at theism. I think that is where you arrive when you utilize these witnesses. Christianity is where you arrive if you're a theist. And I think if you're a Christian, I don't see any better alternative than what Joseph Smith brought to the table. And frankly, if someone else has something they want to bring to the table, well, then I'd love to hear about it. So anyway, that about wraps it up for me, Bill.
Sweet. Thank you, Jacob. I didn't mean to put the comment up. I tried to take it off as fast as I could. I was clicking a button on my screen and
Oh, no, you're all good.
Put one up there. Deeply appreciate your time. This is so difficult because we're both so adamant about having a better perspective on how we're arriving at our conclusion than the other person. And I don't want it to be a debate. I really do want it to be that I understand where you're coming from. I think I do, to a large degree, understand where you're coming from. Let me end this way. I deeply appreciate your time and grateful for this conversation. I hope that going forward, we can do a better job of listening to each other. I think there's moments where we're both not doing that.
Yeah.
And
fair enough.
I hope that we continue to have these conversations.
All righty. Well, thanks, Bill.
Okay. Have a great day, everybody. It's going to take about 5 seconds for this thing to close out, but we appreciate you joining us.